Imagine you're a peasant living in 18th century England. The local landlord is looking to add to the staff on his estate. But it's not for a gamekeeper or an under-butler or a lady's maid. He is seeking to employ a garden hermit. The qualifications for the job are as follows. Candidates must be male, preferably elderly, and willing to forego cutting their hair. Candidates must be willing to live in isolation on the lord's estate. He will, of course, provide a hermitage. And finally, they must be willing to dispense folksy advice in order to entertain guests as they wander through the fabulous gardens. This sounds fake. Understandably so. It's hard to imagine that people would spend money to have essentially a living garden gnome on their property, but they did. And today, we are going to explore why. I'm Nicole Miras, and this is Fireside Fables. A fun fact about me is that during the pandemic, I watched a lot of BBC's Gardener's World. Today, I am drinking a nice cup of English breakfast tea, the sort of thing I imagine you'd want after walking through the garden in your wellies on a drizzly morning. I don't even have a garden, just a lot of houseplants. But during COVID, there was something so comforting about Monty Don and Company. A quality that will really stick out to you, though, especially as an American viewer, is the distinctive look of the English landscape garden. It's not rigidly formal, it's loose, it's romantic. A flower fairy could fly by at any moment. The English landscape garden is meant to appear effortless, but the UK is home to some of the best landscape designers in the world. So these sites are anything but unplanned. That look of what some might call structured informality developed alongside the Romantic movement in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. At the same time that the secular garden hermit became trendy, suddenly the landed gentry across the UK began building these hermitages on their estates and seeking out hermits who in some cases were banned from speaking at all, and in other cases were asked to socialize and entertain guests in order to evoke a mystical past. One might argue that this was the height of performance art. By the way, if you are interested in folklore and weird stories from history, then you should definitely subscribe to this channel. Living garden gnomes are the tip of the iceberg. We've explored everything from medieval legends to fairy hoaxes, haunted country estates, and bizarre historical moments. Liking and subscribing helps me to find more lovely viewers like you. Before we dive into the garden hermits of the 18th century, we need to look back on the origins of the hermitage. Prior to the Protestant Reformation, hermits in Europe, as you might have guessed, were largely religious in nature. These were monks or nuns who lived in solitude as part of their religious devotion. A famous example is the 14th century anchoress Julian of Norwich, an English mystic and the author of Revelations of Divine Love, the oldest surviving text in the English language by a female author. She lived in a cell attached to St. Julian's Church in Norwich, from which she could attend Mass and speak to visitors who were seeking out her wisdom. But in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation, during which monasteries were broken up in newly converted countries, religious hermeticism fell out of fashion even in Catholic countries. According to the historian Gordon Campbell, whose book The Hermit in the Garden details the history of secular hermitages, the earliest garden hermitages originated in southern Europe. One early example of a garden hermitage arrives in the 16th century, when the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V famously abdicated the throne because of his poor health. He split the empire into two, giving Spain and the Netherlands to his son Philip II, and the remaining territories of the Holy Roman Empire to his brother Ferdinand I. He retired to the monastery of Yusta, where he commissioned the construction of a miniature palace below the cloister. But it was in the UK where the garden hermitage, and by extension the garden hermit, would take off during the 1700s. A variety of factors contributed to this. Crucially, enough time and distance had passed since the Reformation, so British people could romanticize the medieval past without risking association with Catholicism. And speaking of romanticizing the past, in the late 18th century, you have the emergence of the Romantic movement. This was a rejection of some of the more sterile aspects of Enlightenment philosophy in favor of elevating subjective experience, emotion, and the tangled nature of the human psyche. This also translated to the rejection of the French neoclassical garden, which had previously been all the rage, in favor of the structured informality that we discussed earlier. And part of this also likely had to do with the desire of creating something that was quintessentially English, rather than just following the French. British landscape designers still found inspiration in ancient Greek architecture, but by the late 18th century, they were embracing the Romantic movement's obsession with the past, specifically by constructing artificial ruins on these estates. The goal was to make it appear as if these structures had been standing since time immemorial, when, in fact, they were a few years old. A modern comparison would be the fake industrial trend of the 2010s. After it became trendy to take old warehouses and factories sitting in the middle of cities from America's industrial past and repurposing them into coffee shops, restaurants, you name it, some developers took note and began to build new structures that copied that style, adopting the visual cues of a 100-year-old building in order to make a new building seem old. Okay, so artificial ruins, romantic landscape design, that's great, but these gardens, we're still missing something. They had the romantic design, the loose fairy tale feel, the crumbling, dilapidated garden follies. All they needed were hermits. It's unclear who was the first garden hermit, but the most famous example was the perpetually barefoot 90-year-old Father Francis, who was the garden hermit of Hawkstone, Sir Richard Hill's Shropshire estate. He lived in a little cottage where he received Hawkstone's visitors. Because he was so old, he couldn't always be on duty, so sometimes he was replaced with a stuffed automaton dressed as a druid, or at least whatever the English thought druids dressed like. But Father Francis, by all accounts, had it good compared to other garden hermits. Some landowners, like Charles Hamilton, had more exacting standards. When he hired a man named Mr. Remington to be the garden hermit at Painshill, he demanded that Remington remain silent at all times. Remington was banned from cutting his hair and nails or trimming his beard. He could never wear shoes, and he could not leave the grounds of the estate for 7 years. After 7 years, he would be paid the equivalent of roughly 100 to 130 grand today. This arrangement did not last. The story goes that 3 weeks later, Remington the garden hermit was found at the local pub. Sometimes these residencies were for shorter periods. One advertisement from the late 18th century references only a great house in England, which would pay £300 in exchange for a garden hermit residing in an artificial cave on the property for 6 months out of the year. During those 6 months, he needed to maintain his beard and live in a state of picturesque dirtiness, and be willing to entertain guests when the estate hosted parties. In other cases, the gentry would play the role of the hermit, at least for an hour or so. Most of the hermitages on these estates were empty, and the idea was that the landowner could retreat to their hermitage during long walks on their estate. There was this glamorization of melancholy at play, as well as this harkening back to the secret knowledge and mystic visions of medieval Catholic hermits. The ornamental hermit and hermitage allowed the wealthy to play act as if they had some connection to that secret knowledge, without having to actually embrace any real mysticism. Ornamental hermits fell out of fashion by the Victorian period. Some of this had to do with the nature of trends. Fads like this inevitably die. And part of it had to do with growing abolitionist sentiment in the UK, with many concerned that these roles were rife for abuse. Think about Mr. Remington, who was asked to be silent for 7 years. I'm curious to know, is this a job you would be willing to take? It strikes me as a much grittier version of being an artist in residence somewhere, but I do wonder if this is something any of you would be willing to do. The whole not bathing thing would be a stretch for most of us, hopefully, but what terms would you accept? Could you take a vow of silence? Or would you be willing to take the job if, like Father Francis, you could talk to people and take breaks? Ultimately, though, I see the ornamental hermit, this living garden gnome, as peak performance art. A hint of, let's say, tolerable mysticism for the upper classes, without having to embrace the real thing. Thank you so much for watching. If you're enjoying Fireside, please make sure to subscribe and maybe even share it with a friend or two. Be well, and I'll see you next time.